Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence.
All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane Lemaster, and we are here for episode number 74 with a good friend and fellow colleague and peer, Katie Markley. How are you?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I feel like we're coming through recording this through this interesting time where we're all in lockdown a little bit with everything going on with this pandemic. So I'm doing well, but also just in the midst of this bizarre time.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to, give our podcast like a nickname or something, something happy, but something that also reflects sort of like the times. And for me, I'm recording from my house in my podcast studio, so I'm still in my pajamas. So I'm going to call this the Pajama Podcast, even though you're at work and still out in society. But anyway, so welcome to the show. And the first question that I always ask my guests is the same. And that question is, so the title of the podcast is Conversations with the Mind. And I just want to know what that phrase means to you personally and how it lands and maybe what comes up around that phrase, Conversations with the Mind.
Yeah, I mean, ever since I first heard the name of your podcast, it kind of generated something for me just around the work I actually do with folks with mindfulness. And I think Conversations for the Mind, for me, gives me a sense of this idea that we all have these different parts living within us, these different parts of our psyche, and that we have to, in order to heal and resolve parts of ourselves, we have to be able to talk to those parts from the state or the role of the witness. So the witnessing part of ourselves, the higher consciousness part of ourselves, has to be able to go in and actually see the various parts for what they are, maybe younger versions, wounded versions. And so for me, I guess I'm always having these conversations with my own mind and with the minds of my clients from this stance.
Yeah, I love how you put that, because that's how I feel in my personal and professional life as well currently. But as you were saying that, like, I got this image of myself when I was like in my teens and my early 20s, like the first half of my 20s, and conversations with my mind back then did not seem like it was many different voices that I had to, as a higher being, interact with and have a relationship with, which I understand now. Like, to me now, it feels like all these voices are sitting at like this boardroom table, and it's a circular table all with equal voice, except, I have like an executive function above them. I can veto them, but I listen to them. Whereas back then in my teens and 20s, like, all those voices were just yelling so loud at each other from across that table that it all sounded like one voice for me.
Yeah. And I think I love the way that visual really lands for me too. I feel that way myself. And I don't know exactly when I became like the director of my own conference room, but I can distinctly feel that shift. And I love helping people into that seat as well, of feeling confident that they've got this and that there's nothing wrong with them. I think that we just have really a lack of guidance in our society in particular. I can't really speak beyond the society about this piece, but I think that people just need the confidence that they are fundamentally whole and well, and that there's nothing to be ashamed of or afraid of with how their psyche operates, and just learning that, like, loving kindness towards themselves, to be the kind caregiver, the sort of benevolent witness.
I think that's going to be a tough nut to crack in this society, at least right now, because, and my wife and I were having this conversation like last week about how most Western religion is based off this idea that as soon as you're born, you're fundamentally a sinner. And so you have like this life in front of you to make up this debt that you already owe to this higher being. And if you don't do it, then you're going to a bad place, you know?
Absolutely.
And I think that's what that's the thing that did not sit well with me as a kid going to Sunday school. My mom was like this, freer spirit. She let me and my brother choose what we wanted to, but we still, had some structure around religion when we were really young.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just turned off by the Western model. And then so happy to find in college, the Eastern models of Buddhism and Hinduism that speak of like you being born as this perfect being, this perfect, innocent, can do no wrong being. And it's up to you to sort of balance your karmic debt throughout your life. You can do good deeds and you can do bad deeds, and you probably will do both, but do more good than bad, and you'll be fine. It seems like the Western religious models breed a lot of like inherent fear in people's minds, and so there's a lot of people in our society going around like with that fear-based mindset around themselves and their spirituality, thinking that they're like sinners already, rather than people going around, like you said, and like having this idea of I am whole already, like I'm perfect the way I am. And I can still improve and I can add to that, that wholeness factor is not, that's crazy.
I know. I'm really feeling into what you're saying and resonate with that. I mean, I think that sometimes when people come into my practice, I want to talk with them about how the ultimate goal is learning more self-love and compassion. And sometimes that will really intimidate people and they'll be like, whoa, that's a lot to bite off. But it's just a process, just like anything else. And I think that what you're talking about is like this Judeo-Christian influence of original sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how that's really kind of woven into society is like, we do have some fundamental like badness or tendency towards doing evil things, even, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the Buddhist philosophy of basic goodness, do you know basic goodness?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so like,
but explain it to the audience a little bit.
Yeah, that's just really turning it all on its head, where it's like, actually, no, we're born fundamentally good. You can actually look at a baby, and I don't know how anyone could argue anything different than that there's just pure innocence, goodness, and love coming from a baby. And that it's more the experiences that we have as we're growing up, and we're inevitably going to get wounded, we're inevitably going to be misunderstood or not be seen accurately. And it's all those experiences that can sometimes on the far end be traumas, or can just be challenges or related to the inherent suffering of life, that then we end up creating these like strategies for survival. So maybe in order to get loved and seen, we develop some kind of pattern that ends up hurting other people or ourselves. And it actually really works for us initially, because where that drive is coming from is it's actually coming from a very good place. We're trying to get our needs met to survive in the world. And as we get older, that strategy actually stops working for us, and it maybe becomes more maladaptive. And I think that's where people go to seek counseling or support, because they're like, I do this thing and I'm so messed up. And it's actually like, no, if we go way back to why you started doing that thing, it was a brilliant strategy. Mm-hmm. That came out of your basic goodness and really innate wisdom. And now it's like a confused attempt at love. It's a confused attempt at goodness.
Yeah, I think you could apply that, that structure to almost any, mental health disorder. And I'm using quotations here because, the DSM has its own wacky political history that is underlying the diagnostic thing. But like you could apply that to just like depressed mindset or anxious mindset or diagnostics like reactive attachment disorder or something like that, where, something happened in somebody's past, and to get that anxiety and put them in fight or flight was helpful for them to protect themselves as that survival. And they learned that this is like the safest way for me to go through the world, and accepted that into like their identity. Like it went down one level from being a coping skill to now this is like who I am and how I deal with the world. And that can be the same for depressive mindset. I I've been depressed in the past and been in my active alcoholism and addiction and, times of suicidal thoughts and crazy things like that. And, well, I shouldn't say crazy things because suicidal thoughts are extremely normal for people to have. But for me in that moment, like that's what it felt like. Like I was going,
felt out of control.
Yeah, so off of what my baseline was, that I learned like those were like my coping mechanisms. And once they became part of my identity, they became destructive in nature, I had to reel it all the way back and figure out like, oh, that's the reason why this addiction probably manifested. This is why, this depression happened here, and go back and heal that stuff so that I could like fast forward to where I am now and sort of like have that part of my life compartmentalized, but like in a healthier way. Yeah. I was wondering, sorry, could you tell people what you do? I just want people to know like what you do for a living, but what you also do for the pleasure of it.
Yeah. So I'm a transpersonal psychotherapist. So I'm really acknowledging the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. I do somatic-based art therapy in my practice. And typically people come to see me, adults who will acknowledge like, I have trauma, I have a trauma history, and they want to work through that with support. So my work is always coming through this trauma lens. And I also really value working with altered states of consciousness. So right now I'm also working in a Ketamine-Assisted psychotherapy clinic here in Boulder. It's called the Integrative Psychiatry Center. And I'm a MAPS trained therapist in working with PTSD and MDMA. So hoping that I'll be able to use that training here soon for the expanded access once it's available.
Nice. I love what you're doing because it's very similar to the path that I'm following as well. And I thought this would be an interesting time to tell the audience sort of like how we met and how we know each other. I think I first met you in our licensure classes, or we both were becoming licensed addiction counselors at the same time, and we had a class together and hit it off. And then, it was only like a 2-day training, but at the end of the 2-day training, you and I were already talking about like, oh, we need to get together and, have an experience like this, like an altered states experience. And then we found ourselves again, sort of in this small group of people involved with the Native American Church and doing a teepee Peyote Ceremony, which was beautiful. And that was our first sort of other consciousness experience together. And I have very fond memories of that night. I still hold on to some of the visions that I had and the integration that I had with a lot of like spirit animals and things after that particular ceremony. I was wondering how fondly, how much do you remember of sort of our history and how we got to know each other?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, my mom was asking me what I was doing this morning, and I told her about the podcast, and she's like, well, how do you know Shane? And I was like, it's actually a great story how we met in this kind of unusual setting where we were training to be addictions counselors, because it's an interesting pairing to be a medicine person, to work with psychedelics, and then to also be an addictions counselor. And I think that that's a really cool, those are two really cool worlds that you and I both bridge. I don't know a lot of folks that do that. And I think for me, when I went to study to be an addictions counselor, that was the driving motivation under the whole thing, is like, how do I validate my position and make sure that I'm doing the best job I can in bringing validity and knowledge to the field of altered states work. So, and I think that that's where you're coming from too. I'm pretty sure that was, I just sensed that from you, that was a driving force.
Yeah. Well, for me, I kind of just fell into the addiction counseling track. I mean, I have my own history of being an addict of many things. And then my own experiences in inpatient and outpatient treatments, and like all the all the 12-step stuff I've done, and I have that background, but it wasn't until way back in the day I had a partner who just said, like, you should become an addiction counselor, like you'd be good at it. And I kind of just like blew it off. I'm like, no, like I don't want to do that. Like I'm already doing my own addictions work every single day, and I go to meetings all the time, and I don't want to keep hearing people's stories and stuff. But I fell into it because I started working for an agency up here that needed a clinician who had an addictions credential, and so they paid for me to go through with it. And so I was just like, yeah, if you're going to pay for it, I might as well do it. And I already had my master's degree, so I said, let's just go straight for the licensure instead of take all the other steps to get there. And that's what I did. And since then, I've just been so grateful that I did go through the training, because it gave me the entire clinical side of addiction that I needed, and all the education around the science, and all the personal experience that I've had from being, to the bottom and back. And it just like helped me combine those two and made me a really good, really efficient addictions counselor that clients seem to, when they come in to see me, they tell me, like, I connected with you right away. Like, I saw your tattoos all over your arms, and you look like our type of people. And I'm like, I am your type of people, like I've been there, done that. And it just like right away, the rapport it starts building really fast. And so, yeah, I kind of just I fell into that addiction counseling, but it's been a tremendous journey and experience. And I learned so much about myself. And that's one of the areas of my life I get so much like gratitude and just self-love feeling from, is when clients come in and they tell me, or they contact me years later, and they're like, hey, you were a big part of my life. I've been sober for a number of years. And I'm like, oh my God, this is why I do this thing. And like, it's giving me goosebumps right now just thinking about it.
Yeah, I feel you. I appreciate what you're saying. I can hear the heart of it, as you're talking. And I've definitely been at places in my life too, where it's interesting how we get here. Like, being a therapist even, like, is not something that was like a long-term plan that I had sketched out and followed. It just really happened upon my path. And I'm so glad that it is what I do now, because it enables me to continually work on myself. And it's like helped my path to be, I think, a lot more driven towards personal growth than it ever would have been otherwise. But yeah, sometimes I've paused and thought, like, if my life for some reason ended right now, in some way, I think my soul could be at peace just knowing that I've had all these really valuable moments and connections with working with all these people over the years. And I think that that's what everybody strives to feel, that they've made an impact. And so it's been such a gift.
Yeah. Sure. But I think the second half of your question was like how it intersected with my interest in psychedelics. And that connection for me is still a little fuzzy, although my first substance I ever imbibed was LSD at 16 years old. And so I can trace, like, that's like the origin of any altered states work with medicines. And how important and formative those experiences were, I always kept that with me until I was at a place where I could go back and like re-examine my connection to that. And it just happened to be like right at the same time that I met you, and we just started chatting. And that peyote ceremony that we went to was the first time that I had re-engaged with psychedelics in a mindful, spiritual, ceremonial way. Because back in the day, it was all recreational, for sure. Even though there were spiritual insights and benefits and feelings that came with some of those recreational experiences. Like, I always carried that with me and said, this is something important. Like, altered states are important, and they're important teachers. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely helps us get to places I don't think we can really get to otherwise. We have too much stuff in the way, and I love hearing that piece from you, because it just kind of confirms what I already felt I knew, which is when we first met in that setting, this addictions counselor training. I mean, there's always so much fear, I think, in the professional realm of psychotherapy around psychedelics, because there was so much misuse in the general population for years, and they're Schedule I substances. And so I think that when I remember leaning in to sort of talk with you about the potential of doing a ceremony together, and feeling that it was edgy and risky,
Mm-hmm.
but just feeling really drawn to like feeling like I had to ask you if you wanted to be part of that. And it was so great, because your response immediately was relieving. I could tell like that was for you. And it just is great to look back on, like how I almost could have missed the opportunity had I not been listening, but there was this voice in the back that was like, yeah, Shane needs to be there. And it was very true. So
do you have any particular stories or memories from that night in the teepee that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, that first time that we were in the teepee together, I think that ceremony for me was all about really recognizing how different medicines, different substances have like a unique vibrational imprint, a unique healing capacity. And for me, I became so aware that peyote as a medicine is all about humbling oneself. And part of the ceremony is getting well. So it really,
just for the audience, they know what getting well means. It's literally purging, like throwing up.
Yeah.
In their tradition, they believe you're purging up some stuck spirits or stuck energy or stuckness in yourself and getting it out of your body. And there's a whole ceremony that goes into the disposal of it so that stuff doesn't return to you. It's quite beautiful. But
yeah, I always thought it was so beautiful how it's someone's job to come with a shovel and scoop up the vomit and take it out of the teepee. And after it's taken out, there are herbs thrown on the fire to sort of cleanse the air. And it's sort of seen like this is negative energy that has been stuck in you that is now moving out. They put it in a hole that they've prepared in the ground ahead of time. And then at the end of the ceremony, all the getting well from everyone is in this one place. They cover it up, they bury it, and they pray over it. And that is, I just thought that was such a beautiful way of looking at how we take care of ourselves and the actual physical matter of this work, that it's not just concepts, it's real, when you're getting rid of these old wounds. And so, I just remember being deeply humbled by this process of getting well, and also just extreme physical discomfort, because in a peyote ceremony, you're up all night, you're sundown to sun up, sitting upright, holding a sort of dignified posture, because you're really wanting to have like reverence for the medicine and the ceremony as a whole. And you're staring at the fire all night, and it's a very disciplined practice. And I've come to through those ceremonies really respect Native American traditions and how they seem to be sort of aligned with some Buddhist philosophies for me, just around like suffering being part of life. And if you can just meet suffering in a gentle but head-on way, and just look at it and be with it, that then you kind of pierce through this thing where you're no longer afraid or cocooned, but you're really free, because you're able to just feel the temperature shift, whether you're hot or cold, you're able to just accept it and not have to like rush to fix it right away. And so I think through the physical elements and the endurance and the suffering of the ceremony, I came to just feel how humbled the medicine made me and everyone. And you'll probably remember this, but like, in the morning at the end of the ceremony, there's this time where everyone just gets to talk a little bit more. It's less formal. And I just felt the authenticity of everyone just so palpable. And that's my favorite time of the ceremony always, is just everybody's been so humbled, and then you're just so real together.
Yeah, it was beautiful. I've been back a few times since then, and for the same type of ceremony. And I'd say that's my favorite part, as well as emerging from the teepee and just seeing the landscape out there just glow with this life, you know. And then, well, actually, one of my favorite parts of the ceremony too is the sweat lodge afterwards, and that's also a super challenging part of the experience. You know, I don't know how long you sit in there for, like 2 hours, and the temperature is like 200 degrees or something. Like it's boiling in there. Loud chanting and drumming and singing, and that was actually where I had most of my connections with my ancestors, was in the sweat after the teepee ceremony, where the only thing you can see in there is just these rocks that are placed in the middle, and they're so white hot that you can see like red cracks in the rock. They've been on fire all night, and you know, from those cracks, like I don't know, I connected with like this sense of like magma, like lava, like ancient stuff buried deep in the earth, and it had spiritual energy flowing from it. It was amazing to commune with that energy. I also had this experience in that teepee that night where we're all sitting in a circle, like cross-legged around the fire, and I feel like this scratchiness on my leg, on the skin of my leg. And I'm wearing pants, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird. It feels a little weird. And then I was like, no, that feels like something in my pant leg. And I reach up in my pant leg and just like pull this thing out and throw it towards the fire. And it was this huge spider. There's a huge spider that had crawled up my pant leg during the experience, and I flinged him out towards the fire. And the guy sitting next to me saw me do it, and he saw the spider too. Like, we were both looking at it, and we looked at each other, and he's like, yeah, I saw it. And then the spider like started crawling back towards me, and I kind of had to brush it away because it was really scary in that moment. But the guy next to me and I shared that experience, and
he's like, that's real.
Yeah, right. And from that, you know, I figured out like you know, I'd never really looked into like spirit animals or anything. I thought that was a little kooky for me. But after that experience, I was like, this thing had like some kind of connection with me. It didn't hurt me, but it wanted me to know that it was there. And it wanted me to know it was there for me, for some reason, healing, or, you know, I took it as healing. And I looked into, you know, spirit animals, and not too far, but, you know, you just start finding like these connections once you pay attention to these little things like that you'd brush off. But I don't know, I got curious about it, and you start uncovering these things. They're like little treasures of yourself, of your mind, that you get to uncover every day. It's so exciting.
That's
What
awesome.
would you say is your favorite part of the work that you do? Like, it is really exciting and cutting edge work, and yeah, but what's the most exciting piece of what you do?
I think that, well, so the frame that I'm like, how do I start? The most exciting part is definitely in the realm of the altered states work. And anytime I'm doing some altered states work with someone, whether it's being in a peyote ceremony or doing the ketamine work or the MDMA work I've been trained in, it's really preparing people for the way that they're to navigate their like spiritual and psychic space when they're in this altered state, getting them prepared for the fact that it could be scary, that they might have a difficult time, and how they're to navigate that, because it is quite an opportunity to even take an experience that could be bad or seem like, oh no, I shouldn't be doing this, right? And actually take it and move through it and make that part of the goodness of the experience, make that part of how somebody feels resilient and strong. And so I think preparing people, but then also meeting them in those moments where they're scared and they're challenged and they're just kind of at the height of their difficulty in their journey. That's my favorite part, is holding the role of just being the rock, being the solid, trusting guide, and kind of leading them back to their own inner healing intelligence. I think that's the sweet stuff right there.
Yeah, when someone wakes up to that realization that we are our best healers, you're like, yes, you got it. You don't need me anymore. You got this thing. Yeah, when clients come to that realization and really embrace it and lean into it and start living life that way, all I've ever seen is progress. Number one, when people adopt that mindset. But yeah, it feels good in that sense, it feels good to not be needed. As a therapist, like, wow, like I really helped this person transition to who they wanted to be or what they were meant to be or whatever that means.
Yeah, because I think that the altered states experience is really just it's like a microcosm of life in general, and it's like anything that we learn to do in that state, any way that we learn to work through difficult times, then we have that for our whole life. And I think that it applies in times like we're in now, where there's so much uncertainty and fear going around, and how do we employ this ability to trust and move through?
Yeah. So I want to go back to what you said, this Buddhist Native American philosophy of suffering as being part of life. That was when I first read that. That felt so good to read that in words. Like I had been living my entire life. I think I was like 21, 22, suffering so bad, but denying that I was suffering and just drowning it with alcohol and things like that. And as soon as I read that phrase that life is suffering, I think that was as simple as the phrase was, life is suffering. It's like, I could like take a breath, like, oh, this is normal. Like what these challenges I've been feeling my entire life, like this is a part of the process. This is what it's supposed to be about. Rather than like, I no longer felt like there was like something inherently wrong with me, that the suffering I was experiencing was actually good. That was the first time I was able to see suffering as necessary and good and something that I wanted to, not like in a masochistic way, like engage with it, but I wanted to understand my own suffering and was willing to go through some more suffering in order to reap the benefits from doing that,
Yeah.
So can you talk more to that, like your experiences or what you've learned about yourself through that understanding, that lens on the world? Because I think it's just a perspective that we can take. Like we can see life as, inherently suffering and doing our best to relieve the suffering. And there's so many different ways of doing. I have here. It's on my coffee water bottle. See if you can see that.
Existence is pain. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Rick and Morty.
Yeah, I love that Rick and Morty quote because I was like, yeah, that's Buddhist philosophy right there. But he's happy about it, Mr. Mises has a huge smile on it. He's like, I'm ready to go. Let's solve a problem, So what's your experience been around this idea of suffering as a part of life?
Yeah. I guess it's just, I just see it as everywhere. Like, we get entrenched in these ideas like, oh, I should be more happy. I have felt in my life, what's the meaning of life? Oh, it's to achieve things and to be happy, right? But if you leave yourself with just that, then I think it's a setup for having dark night of the soul, for feeling really scared when you're not achieving that, because really like the hard things that we go through and I've come to feel that the hard things that we go through and the suffering is really part of the medicine that like humbles us, like we're talking about, and helps us to develop wisdom and helps us to, I think, just tap into more than the superficial and the mundane, more into the sacred. So, you spoke earlier about growing up with this Catholic Christian background.
No, not really any sort of religious background. It was more open, but I think as a way for my mom to like get a break from us kids when we were younger, she would put my brother and I in Sunday school when we were like 5 and 6. And so I had the Sunday school experience, not religious at all, but then in military school too, they forced us to go to, I think it was Catholic mass twice a week. And that was pure pain for me to sit through.
I can imagine. Yeah, I grew up, so my parents are both Catholic, but they were both sort of on the sides of their family that like they were the kids, or maybe just part of the family that wasn't really adhering to the Catholicism. And so, but they still sent me to Catholic school, but they basically encouraged me to be able to think for myself, which was such a gift. And so I remember going through Catholic school all the way through high school and having to go to church and knowing this pain you're speaking of, and just not really understanding it or feeling that it ever resonated with me, and feeling like we were all just sort of going through the motions together without feeling any of the inspiration of it. And then when I was a senior, I had this terrible tragedy happen where my dad ended up taking his own life. And in Catholic philosophy, it's sort of like, well, you go to hell when you take your own life. And I remember going back to school after this had happened, just days after, really. I'm still mourning and grieving. And in our religion class, our teacher had this whole like curriculum where she was talking about like hell and purgatory and death. And she just kind of carried on with the curriculum because I think she didn't know what else to do. And I remember it being so incredibly awkward because my dad had just technically gone to hell in this philosophy. And I remember like at 17, I was like looking at my peers and everybody was completely horrified and stunned. And I was also horrified. And I just remember actually like my consciousness expanding in that moment and being like, this isn't wisdom. This isn't like how one relates to wisdom. It's like you have to be able to adapt, and there's always a way that it makes sense, and it just didn't make sense. And so I think going from that place, I like right after high school, I took time off and I traveled, and I ended up finding a Buddhist retreat center in Australia, I think I was. And that was kind of my introduction to this whole like idea of potentially reincarnation and life being suffering. And it just really resonated to me, having my own suffering of that grief, that this was part of life and nothing was necessarily wrong, but that there was a lot to be gained through it. Like it couldn't be for naught, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just arbitrary suffering. It's like suffering and like there's some gems in there.
Yeah, so I have a question for you that I've asked myself before when like trying to, they tell us in our psychology training, like never do self-analysis, never diagnose yourself, right? But I think that's like the first thing we try and do when we get our first DSM is like, let me see how I fit these criteria. And so I feel like, most of us, well, all of us, because suffering is inherent in life, we've all experienced suffering. We've all experienced trauma at various levels. I'm not saying everyone's is the same, but we've all experienced this aspect, and we can all sort of like connect around this. But then there's a whole nother kind of suffering that I used to engage in that others do as well, but not everybody, and that is self-imposed suffering. So rather than just experiencing, the normal sufferings of life, living, sick, seeing sickness around you, especially right now, seeing death, this is all experiencing of suffering that is normal parts of life that we all have to deal with. But then there's some of us get into this pattern where we've felt enough of that external suffering that we want to impose some sort of control over our suffering, because otherwise it feels completely out of our control, like we're at the behest of the world, and there's nothing we can do. And so we want to exert some control over that, and so we start causing things to happen in our life, or we start, like for me and my addiction, that was a big piece of it. Like, how can I actively, kill myself and hurt myself with this substance and do stupid things and put myself at risk and in danger.
So at least then I know when and how the suffering's coming at me kind of thing.
Yeah, and I can sort of guess how it's going to turn out, as opposed to just like, yeah, just I don't know. I feel like it's a different kind of suffering. It's probably related to the dark night of the soul, like you mentioned. I keep hearing that phrase come up, but I don't think I have a full understanding of where that phrase came from and what the author meant by that when they said it. Like, to me, that it means more like seeing your shadow, working with the shadow, the parts of yourself that you have trouble looking at and trouble dealing with, but are so beneficial to form relationship with. Sorry, now I'm rambling. So
no, I think it's well said. I'm feeling you, and I'm thinking back too as you're saying, like, where does that come from? I definitely know that that term came to me in my transpersonal psychology education, but I can't pull the source. But yeah, I mean, I think that that I can definitely relate to this dark night of the soul concept. And for me, I don't think I've had any personal struggles like the ones you're talking about, where I was really imposing the suffering on myself. I feel like I had a large dose of suffering sort of come my way inadvertently, and then I had to kind of metabolize that. But something I did get into, which I think is along the same veins, is just really pushing myself in outdoor pursuits, even beyond like where I felt like I had capacity, like kind of flinging myself into these really difficult challenges, climbing mountains and rock climbing, and just putting myself in situations where I would actually dread going to do it, but I would know that I needed to approach it and needed to work through it, because afterwards there was this just bolstering of confidence and connection to the ineffable, basically, by meeting such fear and challenge. It's like, I think it's definitely different than what you're talking about, but
right, but it's touching on that self-suffering for sure. I like what I was just referring to, just more on the self-destructive aspects, but for sure in my athletics, I've been an athlete my whole life, and pushing myself past what I think my capability is, like you're talking about with the climbing mountains, and you take on these challenges just outside your comfort zone, in athletics, or in relationships, or in whatever, and it's like those are the things that shape who you are. Those are the things that you look back and you can recall in great detail, those moments of self-imposed suffering. It's like, I'm gonna do this thing and it's gonna suck, and I know it's gonna suck, but I'm still gonna do it. And it's that thing, that sort of acceptance, and also, and I'm still gonna do it. I'm gonna move forward through this. I'm gonna overcome this thing. I think that's what helps shape like all these things, karma and life circumstance and all this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's, I've got two daughters, little stepdaughter and a little, like, almost 2-year-old daughter. And that's just become a big family value for us, just really wanting to push our kids to experience things, particularly in the outdoors, but just in life, where they have to go into it saying, like, this isn't going to be fun necessarily. It's going to be type 2 fun. And at the end, I'm going to be really glad I did it. And so in lots of ways, just helping to expose them to that concept, and not like, we're just going to be cozy and happy all the time.
Did you call it type 2 fun?
Mm-hmm.
That's hilarious.
I've never heard of this term.
No, I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. Because it's like, it's definitely not fun with a capital F. It's the type 2 fun.
Yeah. The fun comes in the second phase, when you complete it.
Yeah, when you're like standing at the top of the mountain or at the end of the match and you're like so glad it's over. That's the kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I definitely want to get into talking about motherhood and parenthood and what that's like for you. But first, I think to lead into that, I just want to touch a little bit more on the idea, and this is sort of like a dual question. So on one part of the question, it's important that I guess we talk about, and we have been a little bit talking about our own experiences of self-work and altered states work on ourselves and our own paths down that. But there's also this thing within our field, and there's nothing really written too much in our field as far as like ethics codes and how we should, conduct ourselves. But we share conversation around these issues still. And one of the things that comes up quite often is how important it is for a practitioner of this kind of work, of altered states work, to have had previous experience in these realms themselves, and also even more beneficial that they have an ongoing practice themselves. In regular psychotherapy, it's often suggested that therapists have their own therapists, that they're getting additional help as well. And so for you, like, can you talk about how important do you think it is that practitioners of this kind of work that we do have a current practice of their own? And maybe if you could, you've already spoken to some of your transformational work, but if anything comes to mind, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah. And it's such a big question, so I'll try and answer, and then feel free to help pin me down if I'm not getting into it enough. But it's like, the first thing that comes to mind is just an experience I had when I started working at the ketamine clinic, because I actually started working at the ketamine clinic having all kinds of other altered states experiences, but never having done ketamine. And for me, not really ever feeling drawn to that substance. Like, I am not really drawn to this dissociative experience, not really seeking an ego death experience. Not that that's always what people have when they're doing ketamine, but on the far end of the experience can be common. And so I was never drawn to that substance. And so in experiencing it, in order to kind of start as in the clinic, that's the policy, is everybody who starts working there has to at least know what they're providing, which I think is essential. But part of what was really valuable about it for me is that before I got the injection, because we do the intramuscular injection as well as the IV administration there. So before I got the injection to experience the ketamine session, I remember being so incredibly nervous, which was shocking to me, because I feel like excited to navigate these realms. And, I felt very trusting of the therapist that was going to be guiding me through. And it was so helpful for me just to understand, even coming from my position, how terrifying it is to step in and do this work. And now I really hold that for everyone when they come in. I really understand how brave it is, and how much they're really relying on my confidence, which in part comes from my experience. And so I think that's the other value, is just like really knowing my own internal landscape and being able to use that kind of as a map or an imprint for other people when they're having their experience. I sort of know where they are. And I know the value of not only learning the tools, but practicing the tools that help one to navigate difficult experiences, because I think that that's what we really need when we go into this altered states work, is like, how do we really work with difficult experiences? So yeah, I have had, my hand held, and I've cried through many different experiences. I think that it's been essential to have those guides. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, totally. No, keep going. This is great. I want to hear more about the tools, because that's a big part of, I do psychedelic integration therapy, but people come to me both before and after their home medicine sessions. And this is often something that we talk about in the beginning. And coming from a sports psychology background myself, I'm all about mind hacks, like how we can cognitively, train into ourselves new neural pathways to make our functioning more efficient. And so, we often in my pre-integration sessions, we'll talk about developing like skills around mindfulness, around awareness of the breath, around having some sort of mental visualization or an anchor, something that you can bring yourself back to if you're experiencing the challenge. We talk about developing skill sets around like letting go and and trusting, and even like some mantra work,
Mm-hmm.
using
Mm-hmm.
mantras as tools to keep you centered and focused during the experience. So what are some of the tools that you found useful? I know you said you have a background in art therapy too, and I think that's a huge tool for after the experience. But yeah, what else?
Yeah, so I think like first and foremost, the sort of groundwork is helping people to understand that the general attitude, which is like you don't want to clench down around an experience, you don't want to contract. There's a certain amount of contraction that's going to be inevitable when you come into a realm where things are new and uncertain. It's just a typical response.
The defense mechanism, right?
Yes.
It's an evolutionary thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really normal, but what it does is it adds an unnecessary element that really doesn't add anything good to the experience, and it doesn't help you move through. Contraction doesn't help you move through. So really preparing people for that, as to be expected, and also sort of giving people a somatic experience ahead of time around what's it like to open and allow, what's it like to move out of our head space and down into the core of our body, to bring our awareness to our chest and our belly, and to really just be a body. I think that's a huge skill that I try and coach people on, being a somatic therapist, is like we live so much from this cognitive place to survive and to live in society, and that's actually not needed. You're safe here, and you can just be a body. You can feel into the sensations that are present, and navigate with the sensations as your guide. You can navigate with the music as your guide. So having music prepared that is going to feel safe and good, and not jarring to people when they're in altered states. And then also in that framework is just this trust that you hold as the guide in their process, in their inner healing intelligence, that like everyone's system again has a pull towards goodness, has a pull towards health, and that if you give it optimum conditions, you give a system optimum conditions, it's going to move right towards health. And so helping the client with that psychoeducation piece, and making sure that they're actually on board with that, and that they believe that they can internalize that they do know the way through, and that their system is working with them, not against them. And so we always have that framework to relate back to.
Yeah, I love that, always moving towards health mindset, because, at least in our culture, we're so focused on disease and like literally like dis-ease. Like we're just like so focused on things that can go wrong rather than like what is actually going right all the time. Our bodies and minds, for the most part, are functioning optimally all the time, because they're always seeking that homeostasis. And I think I never really bought into that until I found the science behind that. And that's basic biological philosophy and theory. We know that earth systems and animal systems, they always move towards optimal homeostasis. Plant life especially, we'll see when this corona thing hit and certain countries stopped commuting, like the air above their countries started clearing off, right? We're going to see how the earth has been, we've been seeing how we've been destroying it, but we're going to see how it responds to some of these little breaks that it's getting. I hope that that's like a wake-up call for us. And that's one thing too, like we were talking about suffering being a part of life. Like I feel like really sad for everyone who has to deal with the corona itself, or with any fallout from that. Like we're all going through our own stuff, and certainly there's a lot of people going through a lot worse than I am. And so I want to name that first. But another part of me that sort of ascribes to this Buddhist philosophy, relaxes a little bit and sees it, maybe from that witness position, and sees that, this virus is not, it's just not scary to me. Like death is not scary to me. These are just these are just cycles. This is just part of life. It's suffering, but there's always going to be a good thing that comes from suffering. There's always going to be a positive thing that comes from it. And so that's what I've been trying to focus on amidst this quarantine and things like that, is like, what's the positive that's coming from this? And the environment's taking a break, and we're all like returning home and connecting to our families, and we all are getting this break from this reality that's literally killing us, and it's literally killing the place that we're living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're talking about I think the natural contraction around something like the coronavirus is so many things. Like, what's the unknown impacts for society, the economy,
right,
the global world, and how we trade and how we travel, and are we going to lose freedoms, and are we going to lose people we love? So there's all these natural contractions, and then the expansion which follows. It's just like breathing. Contraction and expansion is part of all experiences. The expansion is like, oh, well, there's going to be these benefits. Like I was thinking about this even before I saw like the first article about, I think, the fish coming back in Venice to the canals. I read something about that. I was like, this has got to be really good for the environment, all the social isolating. And so I think that for me, I'm not necessarily scared of getting the virus itself, but I am afraid of the unknown, like the new times we're going to be living in. And I think it's undeniable that things will be shifting to some degree. And I think that's where I feel some inherent contraction. It's scary. The unknowns, that's like the biggest work, being comfortable with that. I don't know who really is entirely comfortable with the unknown. But yeah, I think that it's a good opportunity to just notice when we are contracted, and then help our systems move into that openness. And, just to go back to your question a second ago, if you don't mind, around specific tools, because I think it's applicable here too, like breath work, working with the breath in a conscious way, even if that's just simply deepening the breath and bringing it more fully into the body. Contact with other people, connection is one of our main resources. And so we know that we have this social engagement system wired into our nervous system. And that's, in part our mirror neurons, our ability to be able to see somebody else's expression, somebody else's emotional tone, and read that their nervous system is actually okay and regulated. And if we are dysregulated, we can actually borrow someone else's nervous system by looking in their eyes and feeling into their okayness. And so really holding a lot of value in that social engagement system when I'm guiding for people in altered states, that it's really my job to be the strongest and the most stable nervous system in the room, no matter what. So hearkening back onto the trust that I have, and that they can have with me. So I think it's like, don't be afraid to use your resources that you have as far as connection. And we're seeing that right now in the world. I think people are connecting in these online platforms more than ever. And I know that my family's connecting more than we normally do. And that's been a really beautiful benefit of this time. We've definitely been having a lot more conscious conversation. We've slowed down. And as weird as it is to say, I feel like our home life is thriving amidst this really chaotic global scene.
Yeah. Do you ever, in regards to these skills for navigation, do you ever get any like resistance from people? I guess I'm thinking of, I've had some experiences where I've had people wanting to try and hold too much onto their normal coping skills that they're used to, like distraction and, I don't know, for instance, movement and certain tics and things like that. And they're a little more resistant to learning these new skills, these new techniques. But I find like, I don't know, these people to me seem to be more Western oriented in thought, because a lot of the skills that we're talking about, connection to the breath and mindfulness and stuff like that, to a lot of people in our society, that still sounds like mysticism, like how is paying attention to my breath going to help me, and the science is catching up and is proving more and more of these things right every day, but still I get this resistance. And so when I talk about it, I oftentimes like to say, these are kind of like superpowers that you're going to.
I say that too.
The superpowers that you're going to get, and you're going to look around at your peers and see that your peers don't have these superpowers, and it's going to make you move through the world way more effectively. And when I put it in those terms, I think it engages like this little kid in them that's like, ooh, I get to like be able to tune into people's mirror neurons and feel what they're feeling. Ooh, I get to do that to myself. Like I get this greater sense of awareness and peace. That's a superpower.
Yes, I say like, it's like these superhuman powers that we've always had, that through our societal conditioning and the, desire for there to be, control over the masses, that we've actually been, like, these powers have been hidden from us. They've been taken away from us, in a sense, for societal control. And that like, it's our way of re-owning our powers to say, no, I actually can impact the energy in my body. And even just talking about the word energy, I think is so triggering for people, because it sounds like such a fluff word, such a spiritual bypassing kind of word. But like, physics has proven that emotion and energy are synonymous. They're the same thing. And if we can acknowledge that we have emotions, then we definitely have energy. And so teaching people like how to discharge energy from their body that they have stuck, how to, really honor that, like, there's some responsibility that they can take for how they're either holding on to energy or letting it move through. Emotion, you could substitute for that word.
Well, I'm gonna have to come down to your clinic and have you do some somatic ketamine therapy on me, because I'm super interested in the somatic piece. Just because I did a workshop with Stan Groff and saw him doing somatic work on people, and it was amazing what these people moved through. And I've read about the power of it.
Was he doing hands-on work with people? Was he?
Oh yeah, him and his wife were like, they were spooning people on the floor, like together, like sandwiching between them. They were doing hands-on pressure. They were doing stuff with the cranium and the skull. They were doing, like, people were in their breathwork poses, with their bodies just, flexing their muscles. You know how it goes. I forgot what that's called. Trichinosis? Maybe that's wrong.
Yeah.
But then he would go over and like make this small adjustment so that they go just a little bit further than they were, and then they'd have like this big breakthrough and go into complete relaxation. And like, he was doing these amazing things and helping move stuck energy through people. I've had a couple spontaneous experiences myself where in the psychedelic space my body will contort and go into certain positions where like the muscles are tense, and they reach like this intensity that I've never felt before, to the point where this one experience I'm recalling, it was a 5-MeO DMT experience, and like I was laying on the ground and my entire upper torso just raised off the ground as my back like arched back like this. My arms were out wide, almost in like a crucifix position, and all my muscles all the way up my back and my neck flexed the most intensely that they ever had. And at that moment that all the muscles tensed, my spine like popped in like 5 places, and I felt like a realignment of my spinal vertebrae. And then it held for just like a couple more seconds and then released, and it released into this level of relaxation that I hadn't felt for years and years and years. And I feel like I was just holding traumas and physical traumas that had happened to my body through injury, and I was holding on to emotional trauma and familial trauma in my body, and it needed just a full flex or something to feel that release afterwards, And I still have a lot more somatic work to do. I still carry a lot of trauma and stuff like up in my neck and my shoulder. And so I'd love to see what you do and how you do it, because I think that's so important. And that's like trained out of us as Western psychotherapists. We're told, like, don't touch the client, don't do any of this stuff. It's unethical. But for so long, and so many traditions have found that touch between two energetic human bodies is super healing. It's so amazing.
Yeah, I think it's so necessary to, be able to help, especially when things get heightened and people feel that contraction. Um, yeah, the piece for me about integration really comes up in this, in that, like, we need preparatory sessions and we need integration sessions,
Mm-hmm.
and lots of them, because that's where we make sure that people feel comfortable with skills that they're developing, that they there's an opportunity to give consent for different kinds of somatic work. There's an opportunity to check in after an altered state, like, how did that somatic work feel to you? Did it feel supportive? How would you want it to be different? And I think getting really clear on that, because it is something that typically in psychotherapy these days is shied away from and even frowned upon, a lot of physical contact. And so I think doing it in an ethical and really conscious and informed way is important.
Mm. So before we were talking about, like, this getting well aspect of the Native American peyote ceremony that we experienced, is there a similar thing that happens in somatic work where they're like, that's the only thing that I could relate to my somatic experiences, and those big releases were kind of like, it was like the body's way of purging that energy was to engage in it most fully, and then it went away, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's this term in somatic experiencing called sequencing, and that's when we're, like, sequencing out the stuck and stored energy or emotion in our body. And so when we're sequencing it out, it might be in the form of, like, a gesture that our body needs to make when we're processing an old memory, or maybe, if there was physical trauma, there's a way that our body was, like, orienting to the trauma as it happened, that didn't get to be completed. So there's this, like, stuck lack of completion in our body, so that there's a way that it has to be sequenced out to complete. Like, if someone was in a car accident and they were turning when the impact happened, they might have actually not got to see the threat as it was approaching. And so there's still this unresolved part of their psyche, but also their body. There's a stuckness in that position. So they actually get to, in the somatic work, orient and fully look at what might have been coming at them. I think it helps all the parts of us sort of resolve what happened, something that wasn't of our choosing, that was spontaneous and traumatic. It helps us to accept and resolve it.
That's so crazy that there's a term for that, sequencing. It makes total sense. And I can imagine, especially in the ketamine experience, because it is so dissociative and it allows you to take that witnessing perspective, like it forces you into that, and you go back to these past traumatic experiences and actually, see the memory, but do that somatic turning in real life, and, like, experience and actually almost see what was there, like, go back and see the memory totally differently. And but the way I've experienced the somatic releases too is usually in sequence. Like, I'll feel where it is, and then it will move its way out, and then out and out and out, and then out, like, my fingertips. And I'm like, that's so interesting how our body has that intelligence to move things like that way.
Totally. And, like, it's written about in Peter Levine's work, Waking the Tiger. He talks about, just how if an animal, a prey animal, is being hunted or chased by another animal and it gets away and it lives, it'll do this thing that's called pronking, which is when it'll shake and even jump for joy. Like, it's like a celebration of its life and its victory and survival. And so there's a really natural way that we also will shake when we're sequencing out trauma. So like when people are in car accidents, for example, it used to be that first responders would hold people down when they were shaking because they thought it was problematic. And now that they know, and I don't know for how long it's been that they know, but they actually know that that's a really healthy somatic response. So they'll encourage people. And I've heard people say, you know, in my practice, oh yeah, I had an accident, and the medical personnel told me, like, that's okay. It's really good for your body to do. Let it shake. And I thought that was so exciting to hear. And so when I'm helping people to contact traumatic material, whether it's in an altered state session or in a regular psychotherapy session, I just teach them, like, whenever big material comes and you're talking about it, or maybe you're just through it, always just help yourself by doing some shaking, which is at your feet and your hands. Those are the endpoints where we know that we're able to release some of that stored energy. So it's just helpful to get to help work with the intelligence of our system and encourage it to move through.
Yeah, I don't think in Western society we allow ourselves enough opportunity to just shake it out. You know, I think our forms of that are like going to the gym and doing something physical. Usually something physical that's shaking it out. But a lot of people are not very physical these days, and I think especially during this time too, like during this quarantine and stuff, we all just need to spend like 30 seconds in the morning and 30 seconds before bed, just like shake it out, like in the middle of your living room, make it a thing with your kids, you know?
Yeah.
And I think if we can incorporate just something as simple as that into everyday routine, I think it could drastically affect like the mental well-being of all of our people, all of our citizens, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's why exercise is so important, because it lets you discharge the energy while building up your body. I want to ask you, this question goes a little bit more broad, but the whole podcast is about consciousness, right? And we've been talking about different forms of consciousness, and but I want to know, how did you first get interested in consciousness as an idea and as something that you can explore? Where did that come from? Where did your interest come from in consciousness?
Yeah. I think just back to, you know, what I was speaking about earlier when I was 17 and losing my father. And I had several moments like that where I literally felt my consciousness get bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'll talk about that time like it felt like a near-death experience because it was so traumatic for me. And I really had to let like my old consciousness, my old ego identity kind of crumble to integrate all the new information and new truths that I had to accept about life and existence. And so for me, I was just really like, there was nothing else to explore or understand because I had to figure that out. I had to figure out what was up with consciousness and how I knew that there was all of a sudden so much more out there. And so I spent like a year and a half traveling. I went to Nepal, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji.
So jealous.
Yeah, and I got to really like immerse myself in other cultures and just become really curious. Like, what are their beliefs? What are, you know, not coming from this place anymore of like, this is what's right and correct, but just really beginner's mind and being willing to listen. And I think just understanding like how many different ways there are to be and to think and to orient to spirituality in this world helped me to be like, wow, I don't know that there is a right or a wrong or an answer or a good or a bad even. It just made me really curious about how there's just so much diversity and so much choice.
What I'm always been curious about this because consciousness it's just an idea, you know, and every culture, even every individual has their own understanding of what consciousness is to them. And I've been fascinated to hear from people like yourself who've been to other places and interacted with other cultures and asked some of these questions, like what are some of the coolest concepts you've come across from other people in other parts of the world around like what consciousness is, what the meaning and purpose of life is, like some of the answers to those big questions that, you know, we have our own answers here in the US, and mostly it's about capitalism and things like that. But I'm fascinated about more like other cultures, and especially cultures that are like tied to the earth in some way, like tied to the land, or, you know, in tune.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I'm kind of like racking my brain for how I can go back to those moments that were so formative that maybe I just even take them for granted now. I know certainly, you know, back to Buddhism, being really influenced when I was in Nepal and seeing the Nepalese way, there's just like this humbleness, there's this real sense of living in the present and in the now. And I think that just what was so impactful for me about making contact just with the reality of life, and like letting the stories go, letting the stories fall away that we mostly live in, like 90% of the time. And so being able to like witness the stories and just come back into contact with our five senses, which is the everyday, like the reality of consciousness.
The moment to moment experience. There is no past or future, you know. Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting, you know, the Buddhist belief around that is fascinating in that, you know, they believe that in consciousness that past, present, and future are all simultaneous in this moment, and we have the ability to access that stuff at any time. And, you know, that lends more evidence to the ability to do like inner child type therapy work, where you actually regress yourself or bring yourself back to a memory of the past that hurt, and provide like some healing to that being in that time and space. And then, you know, I've done it myself, and it works amazing. You come back to your present day self, and that yourself just feels like healed. Like I healed myself. I gave myself the support that I always needed back then, and now I can feel that as if I transmitted it back to that entity.
Yeah, you can actually go back and heal these past memories in real time.
Yeah,
and operate under that belief.
It's amazing. I don't know where I was going with that, but it, you know, I love that. It's like more superpowers, right? The more you learn, the more you understand that you know even less. But along the path, along the journey, you gain like these new skills, these new insights, these new ways of knowing, you know, that I think that's my sort of underlying version of like the purpose of consciousness, is to like experience itself. Like it's like the universe is experiencing itself through the thing of consciousness in all these infinite ways, you know, as this can, as every molecule of water within this can, as this pen, as Shane, as Katie, but also in every infinite way for every situation. So, you know, in another parallel universe, like that version of Shane didn't show you the pen, right? And the universe wanted to experience that reality as well. So for me, like it is about our present moment, and I am just one of those infinite manifestations of myself in the multiverse of consciousness. But how much it is a gift to experience life just as it is, because this is like the craziest trip I've ever been on, is life itself, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it, I don't know, is it Shintoism that believes like every object is alive?
Yeah. And also polypsychism in the West here believes that too, that every object has a form of consciousness. It may not be like ours, but like this has a consciousness of its own too. And the molecule, the atoms that make up the aluminum have their own consciousness and stuff like that too.
Yeah, I think that has been a really formative concept for me in my travels. And something I've come to learn through my psychedelic experiences too. I mean, I remember one time leaving, it actually might have been the one that we were at together, the first one, leaving the teepee actually in the morning before the Inipi ceremony, which is the sweat lodge, and actually seeing the most beautiful thing. It was like the seed of life pattern, which I've never had like a strong connection to. I wasn't expecting to see that, but I saw like the seed of life woven through the fabric of everything, from the sky to like the little objects on the floor. And it was all perfectly like woven in, and I could see it all moving and alive. And it had this kind of like rainbow quality to it that was shimmering. So I could like turn my head and the rainbow would move through everything. And it just was such a deeply impactful experience for me, because I was like, I can never forget at that the fact that everything is so incredibly alive and interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And I was completely, blissed out. And I remember having to say to myself, it's just the daytime. I'm just experiencing the daytime, but it was just the most beautiful and miraculous thing. And I was like, wow, this is actually always here. And
yeah,
I hold that pretty dear.
Yeah, that's been one of my biggest things that I hold on to is like the simple things, like in your medicine work, your journey work. You have these moments where you just kind of like you either zone out or you zone into it even deeper. And I find myself at times like looking at the simplest things, like a bug on the ground, or or like a little handful of sand, or like a weed growing amidst flowers. And you're like, oh my God, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And it's not the actual thing that you're talking about that is so beautiful. It's the realization of that underlying oneness. Like as you're looking at it, you see like, this is so complex, and yet it's so simple. It's so large, and it's so small at the same. It's all these paradoxes all at once wrapped into this little weed that I'm looking at. And it's that realization of that underlying oneness that you're like, this is the most beautiful thing that I've ever experienced. And it's available to us at any time we want, is the thing. Like, as long as we tune into this moment and like, you pay attention, just pay attention, just sit there and look at some inanimate object for 5 minutes and try not to put your judgments on it, and just look at it and experience it. We can connect with that. That's a superpower we all have that we've forgotten because of TV and entertainment and stuff.
Yeah, it kind of brings me, it reminds me of another skill I'm always working to help people learn and tap into regularly, which is being able to take in the good. And just how much our nervous system is wired towards orienting to threats and really feeling the impact of the difficult things that we experience. It's just wired into our reptilian brain. And so it's so powerful when we can consciously select for the good things that are already there and available. And then we can take them in, not just, consciously or cognitively, but take it in all the way through our body to feel it and to process the good feeling in our system, and just savor it longer. Like, let our system resonate and bathe in the goodness, so that we know the way back to that place, in our neurology and in our practice. So taking in the good, a lot of that, so that then, in an altered state's time, you can also really make the most out of the good parts, and really make sure that people get to integrate that into their system too.
Yeah, I see like these altered states and medicine work and I'm including meditation in this too, yoga in this too, but these are all they're all tools to, in my mind, it's like helping to strengthen those connections to the good things, right? To that orientation. So you're like blasted open, you see, and you're oriented to the good. And if you stay in that, if you focus on that, if you use that time in that space with intention, then you can like make more and more connections to make it easier to get back to that. It's almost like I picture like this neuron, right? And it's covered in this myelin sheath. And the more you engage in those mind spaces, like you just add more myelin to the sheath, right? And as we know from neurobiology, like the more myelin you have around your neuron, the greater insulation it has, the faster the electrical signal between brains, and so between neurons. And so these connections are improved, they're enhanced by by this adding of like protective insulation through the practice.
Yeah, and just building new neural connections. Maybe we don't spend that much time taking in goodness or feeling into good things. And so like there's like underused parts of our brain even that we're getting more access to. And so yeah.
Man. Okay, well I want to get to psychedelic parenting. And I stole that phrase from my friend Jonathan Tompkins, who he has a podcast called Psychedelic Parenting, great podcast. But I want you to tell me what it's like to be, and this is out of just pure curiosity because my wife and I are going to start having kids here in a couple of years, and I don't plan on giving up my interest in altered states by then. I'll probably be further into it by then. But what is it like to be a mother, to navigate parenting and the teaching of these concepts of mind, consciousness, spirituality, navigating that from the orientation that you're at, while also doing this work that's like cutting edge, but is still seen as, you know, taboo among a lot of current mental health industry practitioners. You know, I experienced that pushback too, but I can't imagine if I had little ones around, like asking me, you know, what is death and what is, you know, where do babies come from and what is God and stuff like how would I express that in a way where I'm telling them the truth and I'm not giving them the lies that, you know, they're fed elsewhere. What's that like to be a parent?
Yeah, that's a good and exciting question. I love it. I think it's probably the most passionate area I have of just, you know, my own experience currently is like, how do I do this parenting thing well? And how do I represent who I am in it without trying to like control who these people become, you know, that they get to really think for themselves. And so I think it's always giving our kids the tools to think critically about things, to ask questions, to just, you know, it's like really basic skills actually that come up first is like how to really speak your voice, how to set boundaries, how to communicate, you know, all these things I think are really valuable tools. And then, you know, exposing them to a lot of experiences. I think having experiences is one of our family values. And so, and in that sometimes even just an experience that is a difficult experience, but not necessarily a joyful experience is a good one to have. And so like our teenager who's 17 now, she's come to a lot of sweat lodge ceremonies with us. And really, she came to a vision quest one time that we were at. It was so incredibly impactful for her. I remember, I think she would be okay with me sharing this, so I will, but I remember we were at a vision quest ceremony and we'd really come to know this community so well.
Can you real quick just tell the audience what's entailed in the vision quest? Just because I always wanted to do one of these. They seem like a warrior's dream journey. So tell the audience real quick what goes into a vision quest.
Yeah, so a vision quest is when you know, somebody decides that they're ready to get more information about their path in life, to receive communication about, you know, how they're going to contribute to society and the world in a more authentic way. And usually in Native American culture, which is where the vision quest comes from, it's reserved as like a rite of passage for young men typically. And so, you know, young men are really going into their adulthood having some guidance and some vision and some marking of that passage from boyhood to adulthood. And so I think now it's been, you know, opened up in a lot of ways, and still the group that we've done it with has been really working to honor the traditions and the roots while also allowing women to do vision quest. And now I think you find a lot of people who didn't grow up Native and exposed to these traditions, you know, still in their adulthood, not knowing fully who they are, having ever experienced rites of passage. So it's such a gift for us adults to go through these rites of passage that are really meant for people more in their teen years. And so people will, you know, pray about what they're going to receive in the ceremony. They have to make prayer ties. It's a very extensive process of like taking fabric with colors that represent the directions, filling them with tobacco, praying while you're making these prayer ties. And I forget how many, I feel like it's 108 prayer ties you have to make, and each prayer tie has 7 colors. And so it's, when you think about how many that is in total, it's like hours of work. And so you pray with making the prayer ties, and then the community will actually help walk this person up onto the hill, which is where they're going to be in nature, isolated by themselves, exposed to the elements. So in traditional cultures, oftentimes people will have nothing at all that they'll bring for protection or warmth, or maybe something as simple as like a bison fur or hide. And so there's like no water, no food, no shoes, very basic clothing for the elements, which, you know, you're going to be sleeping outside all night. Maybe you'll have a tree for cover, maybe you won't. So there's the sun element. And so people basically pick a spot, and then the community sort of helps to pray around that person. They put their prayer ties encircling themselves to keep themselves safe. And then that person stays on the hill for a matter of days. Sometimes it's 4 days, sometimes it's 7 days. And when we did Vision Quest, we would pray at certain times of the day and sing from like the main camp, so that the people who were out on the hill could feel us being with them in our presence, in our spirit, and they could feel the support kind of carrying them through the ceremony. And then they would kind of also know what time of day roughly it was by when we were praying.
Nice.
That was a lot of information. I don't know.
No, that's great. No, that's incredible. No water for 7 days.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we did it, it was 4 days. So, you know, it's not that people, when they're out there, can't gather water, right? Things like that. But different traditions have done it really differently. And I think 4 days is how long our Vision Quest was.
Yeah, that just sounds like awesome for me. I want to try that so bad. And you're right. I think we're missing in our culture rites of passage, and that's a super important thing. But I want to hear about your stepdaughter's experience too, because that's where we've veered off a little bit.
Yeah, it was just that, you know, feeling this sense of community, and we were doing, like, sometimes we would do 2 sweat lodges a day at that time when we were holding down the fort at main camp, because we weren't on the hill. We were like in the kitchen preparing the food for everyone and really holding the prayer that was stabilizing everyone on the hill. And so she was just feeling the sense of community and the sense of being loved and supported by all these people who, you know, were kind of becoming like aunts and uncles to her. And we had this women's tent that we were in, all the women from camp, and my stepdaughter grew up most of her life with just a single dad. And so she has, I think, just adapted some of those traits of like not being as emotional, not, you know, sharing her emotions with others and kind of doing that privately. And I remember she broke down and was crying and said she was just so relieved that she realized that she could actually do her emotions with others. And she felt all these women supporting her and encouraging her. And I've actually seen a shift in her from that Vision Quest time, where it's like she received so much love and support, and she realized she could be more open and kind of break down more, and that there was strength in being vulnerable. And I see her living into this like more fullness in herself now after this experience.
Wow. So the community, that's amazing. That sort of transformation that comes from community and connection like that. I'm wondering how do you think that your psychedelic experiences and altered states experiences from the past are going to inform your parenting, or do inform your parenting, like with the younger one, with your younger child, who's what, like 2 now or something?
Yeah, she's almost 18 months.
Yeah.
I think more than anything, it just makes me like a more like I've just been more willing to investigate all the corners of myself. And I've really been willing to, look at the darkness and the light. And I think that I live with maybe less fear than I did before I was a psychonaut.
Mhm.
And that living with less fear, I can kind of impart that into hopefully my kids' experience, that there's really not that much to fear, and that the things that are fearful, you hold reverence for and you hold respect for, and that you, I guess it's like trust and confidence in oneself and knowing how to access support. All these things I think I demonstrate on the daily for my kids. But yeah,
So one of
we have
the,
a good experience.
yeah, one of the questions I've asked myself, like as a future father,
Mm-hmm.
um, will I decide to tell my kids about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, or will I not? Because I remember, like as a kid, being told those things, and then when finding out that they were lies, I was like heartbroken and like, oh my God, like all these adults are freaking liars. Like, I don't want to know them. I don't want to be a part of their system. I think that probably fueled a lot of my anti-establishment mentality even today, like just being lied to about Santa Claus and stuff. So as a future father, I've questioned, will I want to just be as honest and upfront as possible from the beginning, and having this knowledge of like underlying connectedness and consciousness, and that everything's going to be okay. And like, I want to teach those concepts to my kids. But I also don't want them to like miss out in some of the fun with their peers. I don't want them to be the kid that like spoils it for everybody. It's like, actually Santa Claus is like this myth that comes from like, Scandinavia, and like you guys are the Coca-Cola version, like.
Right, you don't want your kids to be so jaded and miss out on the fun and like this
Right.
like ceremony, that the few like ceremonies that we have in this everyday society. Yeah, I agree. I think our stance, and we're constantly like revising and questioning ourselves, but our stance really right now, and my partner's stance when he was raising my stepdaughter, was that we don't like lean in there and unteach what they're getting from society necessarily. Like if they're excited about Santa and they're hearing about Santa, okay, like we can be into Santa, but then when they directly ask me, is Santa real? Then that's where rubber meets the road, and we get to talk about the fact that, you know, why Santa's a thing, and that there are some really good things about Santa being an idea, but Santa isn't real. And that's where we step in, but we allow it to be present and be enjoyed until our kids want to know more.
I think that's a good tactic. Like let the hard questions come to you. Don't try and go out there and solve them before the kids have those questions.
Right. And I think, like right now, your values always come into like play when different things are going on in society. And right now, as we've had all this craze and panic buying and all this stuff happening with coronavirus, our teenager has been really like not tapped in, as I think just doing a good job being a teenager. She's just really not been concerned or tapped in. And I think taking in what other teenagers are saying, which is like, that they're just not worried, and it's not going to impact them anyway, and so we're really having to have a lot of hard talks with our teenager recently, where we're wanting to hold her to more thoughtfulness and more concern for the greater good, and contemplating other people's experiences, because that's just not where they're at, in their development. Like, she's not fully developed in that prefrontal cortex, and she's so, you forget like how young they are sometimes, because they're so insightful and mature in all these ways. And then you're like, oh, right, you actually need help being brought out of yourself and taking in these larger concepts. And so we've had a lot of challenging moments where we're triggered by her outlook or whatever. And we want to help her to understand, where society is going and what's happening in a larger sense without scaring her. And so navigating all those places it's pretty exciting, actually.
It sounds like, yeah, it sounds like raising and imparting values and understanding on youth is extremely fulfilling.
Mm-hmm. It is. I feel like it's really exciting. Like, if you don't do it well one day, they're so adaptable and flexible. You can come back the next day and repair
Mm.
and reframe the message if you need to. But I think that it's a time where my partner and I go to bed most nights and we're like, how do you think we did when we had that conversation? And we have to kind of break it down and see if we need to get back at it, because
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to know what to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to get a sense from you, since you are so tied in with, so many different things, the ketamine clinic, somatic work, maps and things like that. I want to know what's exciting for you. Like what's the newest idea on the frontier of this kind of work that you're just like, oh my God, that's something amazing, and maybe it's not manifest yet, but it's something I want to do.
Yeah. I love that. I think the most exciting thing for me, I mean, the work with MDMA to me is just like everything, because I feel like it's so beneficial for resolving trauma. And my view is everyone has trauma and everything's on a spectrum, of course. But so I just feel like it's so incredibly healing. And I am really excited about the idea of doing intergenerational trauma work and doing family work by having MDMA retreats for families, and really getting to work out, wounding and messages that we've had since, before our parents, and how that's come through, and, grieving together the ways that things could have been done better, and reframing. And yeah, it feels like a really rich environment, and really exciting to me to maybe work for or have a family retreat center.
Nice. Yeah, MDMA is quite the healer.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah,
all.
what do you think about that idea of family MDMA retreat?
No, it sounds amazing. Like healing. Yeah. I was talking with a friend of mine who's more in like a civic position in society. He's like a community organizer.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about how you could potentially like heal entire communities with MDMA. Like say there's like a flash flood that takes out half the town or something, and then you could say, hey, it's not mandatory, but we're offering this spiritual healing, or this MDMA healing session at the local YMCA this weekend, and we'll have professional people here to help us heal as a community. I think it could be used to heal, gang communities and impoverished communities and communities after natural disasters,
Mm-hmm.
and help people come together, and love each other, as opposed to go into like this scarcity mentality that we're seeing now, and like stocking up. And I went to the grocery store and I saw people like pushing past elderly folks to get in line before them because they didn't want to stand next to them, and like all this discrimination going on. There's still some self-serving stuff going on right now, and it's sad, but
It actually reminds me of this film, which I still haven't seen. It's crazy I haven't seen this, but have you heard of this film Trip of Compassion?
no.
So it's about the MDMA study, the phase 3 study that's happening, and it's a worldwide study, and it's one of the sites is in Israel, and so they've actually documented some of that process in Israel. And in the study, they've got people who are Palestinian and Israeli, and they have to work through some of this like cultural context and conflict before, during, and after the MDMA experience for it to go well. And so I think that it's just been something I've been really excited to see, and I know that it's been really healing for that community.
Yeah, cross-border healing is possible too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited. For me personally, I go back to my roots in mental performance optimization, and I'm really looking forward to LSD research opening back up eventually. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and really trying, I mean, there's so many good researchers and good practitioners working on healing um, disease and disorder and trauma and things like that. That's awesome. We need everyone on board. But I haven't found too many people who want to study, how do we use these psychedelics in a meaningful way to better the well, to help people who might not identify as having any problems, but just want to transition or transcend to the next level of their own consciousness and their own level of connection and understanding with nature. And I think that everyone deserves access to these things. You were talking about an expanded access program coming through the pipe soon, but we don't have to get into that. But yeah, expanding the access to everybody, and seeing the mind and consciousness and our ability to explore and ask questions as a fundamental human right. This is something that we were born with and should not be restricted as far as like how we choose to identify with that or look into that, or no one, I don't believe anybody should be able to tell me how I can or cannot explore my own consciousness.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it kind of reminds me about the parenting question a moment ago, which is like I parent in a way that I accept that we've been doing exploration in our consciousness and with substances since the beginning of humankind, and that's going to continue. It's an innate human desire and drive, and that our teenagers, they are going to explore. So whether it's happening with us and informed by us, or just kind of willy-nilly out there in the world, like it's going to happen. And so we have a opportunity at how to shape that and bring more safety and knowledge into that realm for them.
Yeah, and help. Yeah, we got to break down the stigmas that have been attached to it. So I want to be mindful of the time, Katie, and we've been going for almost 2 hours, and I want to thank you for coming on the show for sure. We have a lot more to talk about, and you'll probably be one of my return guests in the near future. But I'd like last parting words. If you had anything that you could share with the audience, some little nugget of wisdom that you've always carried with you in your pocket, something that you've learned along your path through this life so far, and something that you want to impart and bring to this collective consciousness toolkit that I'm trying to compile here with this podcast. Every guest comes on and shares their tools, and they just get added to our toolkit for all the listeners. And I think we all have something equally valuable to contribute, some essential puzzle piece that's going to make this image be more visible to us. So what would be something like that you'd want to share?
Yeah, it brings up so many things. It's like a little hard to pin down the thing to say here. Maybe it could be something around just the importance of psychological flexibility. Like, I think that I've just come to see time and time again in my work that like wherever rigidity exists, whether it's in any part of our system, not just the psyche, but wherever we find rigidity, that's like a weak point. And that's a point where we actually can look out for our own health and well-being by saying like, we actually have to go into the places where there is rigidity and generate more flexibility. And I think that we get psychological flexibility through self-compassion and love. And so learning to be more patient, gentle with ourselves, kind, that really bringing that attitude towards ourselves. I call it the attitude of healing. Bringing that attitude towards ourselves, I think, is the best thing that we can do to stay well and healthy for our whole life.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, thanks for being on the show. Like I said, I appreciate it. And if you're down, I'm going to have you on the show in the future. So.
Yeah, and thanks for your time. I've always been impressed by how long you really take to talk with your guests and your podcast. Like, some podcasts are like 20 minutes long, and you really take the time to just get in there, and it's really cool to have so much of your time to explore these things. So thanks.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating to me, like consciousness and the idea of consciousness and exploring what that means, not just for me, but now that I know that, we're all in this together, and, my beliefs saying that your consciousness is just a reflection of my own consciousness too. Like I need to understand other people's consciousness as in depth as I can. And I can only get that through these longer conversations and in future experiences and interactions I'll have with you. We'll get to know each other much better.
Totally.
All right, Katie. Yeah, so until next time, folks, thanks for listening. And this has been Conversations with the Mind. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.